Welcome back. Time now for part two of the France 24 debate. Today we're talking about Ukraine and the global reaction to the staged murder of anti-Kremlin journalist Arkady Babchenko, who it turns out was not killed in front of his home on Tuesday. Well, together with our panel, we're discussing what was the object of the unusual exercise, staging his murder, and to whose advantage does this play? Well, let's listen to what a Ukraine expert at the Chatham House think tank said about the rationale behind that stunt.
I think it has been a success that it saved the life of a journalist, that it led to a possible prevention of 30 other deaths, and it possibly led to an evidence of Russia's engagement in the territory of Ukraine to destabilize and to present Ukraine as a failed state where its law enforcement cannot protect. But it could undermine a very fragile trust that is already in Ukraine to law enforcement about the means and the tools and about the facts that are being presented as the facts, but then they turned out to be false.
Okay, and that was a Ukraine expert at Chatham House speaking there, saying she thinks it was a successful operation and that it has worked to Ukraine's advantage and saved the lives of several other journalists. Let me put that to Katerina Krug in Kiev, a fellow at the think tank Kremlin Watch. Let's just pick up on that point about how this stunt by the Ukrainian secret services has in fact saved the lives of other journalists. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, obviously, I would very much agree with the colleague from the Chatham House, but I would also like to remind that before my Ukrainian colleagues were mentioning also deaths and killings of other Ukrainian journalists and also how high-profile killings of Russian citizens that took place in Ukraine, but also would like to remind of a very high-profile killing which took place a few years ago. I believe it was in 2016, of the Ukrainian officer at SBU who was collecting evidence of Russian crimes in Donbass and in Crimea, meaning that this war of assassinations is taking place in Ukraine for a very long time, especially targeting people who are collecting evidence and presenting to the world the fact that Russia is indeed, has indeed invaded Ukraine and is responsible for many crimes against humanity and obviously violations of human rights. Now, going back to the point which was mentioned and obviously the question that you asked, that we were able to save almost more than 30 people in Ukraine. Babchenko himself today during the press conference that took place, that was live just a few hours ago, mentioned that he wasn't the highest ranking person on the list. This is the only thing that he could disclose, the only thing that he knows from the SBU. And Russians himself explained and described him as a low-ranking journalist and so on and so forth. So we have all the reasons to believe that he was the key element to uncover the entire operation and to prevent even high-profile killings who might target Ukrainian journalists as well, but also probably Ukrainian politicians.
Yeah, you mentioned that press conference at which Babchenko spoke and saying he's basically just happy to be alive. I believe we can listen in now to an excerpt of what he had to say.
My goal was to stay alive and ensure the safety of my family. That is the first thing I'm thinking about. Journalistic standards are the last thing I'm thinking about now.
Okay, the man at the centre of this story. Let me put that to you here in the studio. Your thoughts on what this operation has achieved, because some of our guests have been saying, and indeed the expert at Chatham House is saying, that this has prevented the lives of other journalists from being lost. It's also raised the profile of a serious problem, hasn't it? That if you speak out against Vladimir Putin in certain parts of the world, your life could be in danger.
Well, of course, I think Mr. Babchenko is right. I mean, after all, everybody is very happy that he's alive. Maybe it could protect also the life of other people who are threatened one way or another. But let's put it in a wider context, of course. I mean, next year we are going to have an election in Ukraine. And, of course, Mr. Poroshenko is expecting to be re-elected. And probably in making that choice, which was a very dramatic choice, because, after all, there were probably other ways to protect Mr. Babchenko than to stage a fake murder, which is an extreme choice and which put in doubt the word of the Ukrainian authority. So maybe it's also because Mr. Poroshenko is want to be assertive in view of the election of next year, and maybe also because he doesn't want any move towards any kind of reconciliation with Russia. Because after all, being in war in Russia, or in a certain kind of war, is the best way for him to be re-elected. And we can see, I mean, from the visit of the German Chancellor in Sochi a few days ago, the visit of Mr. Macron in Petersburg a few days ago, there are some moves to try to find a solution to put the Minsk agreement in operation. And I am not sure that Mr. Poroshenko is willing to do that.
Can I ask for a reaction from Alex Ryabchin? You're an MP and you're based in Kiev. What are your thoughts there on what Mr. Blanche-Maison was saying?
Yeah, I could agree with these words, because like I represent, for example, Yulia Tymoshenko political party, who is now the main popular candidate to become a president. And our position when we find out that Arkady Babchenko was assassinated, basically, we criticize it, the authorities, demanding from them to finally solve some cases. And yesterday, the general prosecutor just appointed to the words of Yulia Tymoshenko, saying, you see those politicians that try to make political bonuses, but we did it. So Mr. Poroshenko, and he is appointed, the general prosecutor and the SBU, the head of SBU, they used this in internal political discourse to strengthen the Poroshenko's position, unfortunately. So, but definitely I would say that the sting operation to save life of Mr. Arkady Babchenko and to reveal those 30 names or surnames that we find out that there is a list of politicians or journalists that could be also killed or assassinated, maybe it was worth it. But like I would like to say that in Parliament we have, in the second reading, a very important law on national security, when we will increase the control, the civil control on our security services. So this is what we are demanding, and I think that after adopting this law, we will never have these cases anymore, when our security services brought us a bit of mistrust to international society.
And just with regard to evidence that indeed Russia was plotting to kill Babchenko, I'm just wondering, I mean, there has been some video footage put out. We can look at some of it now. This is from a spy cam, which was inside the car where the hitman was in discussion with someone pretending to be the one issuing the contract for the life of Mr. Babchenko. I mean, from what you've seen, and I mean, I'll put this question to you. I mean, have you seen any evidence that strikes you as being solid and conclusive that indeed Russia really was trying to kill this man?
Let's say when Russia has invaded Crimea, their troops, they had no insignia, which means, speaking of evidence, it can be anything and everything. So I personally, I cannot neither confirm nor refute whether there were Russians behind it. But taking into account the recent history of car bombings in Ukraine, that, for instance, the chief of foreign security services, I mean foreign intelligence, he's been assassinated in Kiev, and another journalist was killed as well. So who would actually benefit from it? I mean, if you see the international reaction, the journalist has been killed in Kiev. Oh, Ukraine is a failed state. Ukraine didn't manage actually to protect him, and then actually he wasn't killed. Why did you do it? So you see there is this problem that no matter what Ukraine does, it will be criticized.
Let me let's return to Katerina and ask you for what you think. Going back to this question of evidence, I mean, have you listened, for example, to the dialogue of that recording from the hidden camera between the supposed hitman and the supposed person putting out the contract on Babchenko's life? I mean, does this tell you conclusively that Moscow really was caught on camera trying to kill that man?
Well, first of all, before answering your question, I would like to answer part of the question that you asked of another guest of yours. What is the result of the entire operation? I think that one of the most important results are even the most public ones. Let's remember that it wasn't a public operation for international audience or even for Ukrainian audience. It had very strong and very solid intelligence component in that. And I think that probably the most important part that Ukraine achieved in this is that we were able to catch Russia or anyone who was preparing the assassination by surprise. Another thing that we were able to uncover the network of people who were planning the assassination, who were cooperating with the probable assassins, and obviously shaking their structure a little bit, because for them it would take some time in order to regain back the balance and go back to their mechanisms of work. So I think by doing this, we definitely have won some time for other security operations taking place. Obviously, there is also another interesting case, which it's very sad that hasn't been mentioned before by our panelists, together with SBU and Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Recently, they have uncovered the plot, which still was very widely commented by the Western audience, with Nadia Savchenko. And they also presented a lot of evidence, and that proving that she was cooperating, and people working with her, they were cooperating definitely with Donetsk occupation forces, which might lead them directly to Russians. Now, going back to your question, right during our break, I was checking Twitter, and SBU of Ukraine, like the official Twitter, they confirmed that they started issuing their official suspects in the criminal proceedings, meaning that they are ready to give more solid evidence. And we will see how they will be linked. Definitely the person that has been mentioned by the Radio Liberty, who is the most probable suspect in this case, he was previously working very closely with MPs from the Party of the Regions, a very pro-Russian party, whose president, Viktor Yanukovych, led to the killings on Maidan and later fled to Russia. So I still think that it's probably too early to look at all the evidence, because it looks like the SBU is definitely giving them part by part, portion by portion, because every few hours we get new confirmations, new evidence. So maybe in few hours, or maybe even tomorrow, we will know more. So far, unfortunately, we have to rely on the words of SBU. But last thing, I do very much hope that SBU, knowing that they made very loud case, both in Ukraine but also internationally, would understand that they really need to provide a solid proof, because so far, if they wouldn't, it would destroy the entire case and shred not only their credibility, but of the entire country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to put that question to Alex Ryabchin. I mean, it's really important, isn't it, that the evidence that's put forward to the rest of the world is absolutely conclusive, because if it isn't, Ukraine doesn't look quite as clever as it would if it did, and that's putting it mildly. What are your thoughts about where we are with the inquiry and the arrest that's been made?
Yeah, I completely agree with the previous speaker that yet we haven't received a solid evidence. Our security services giving them part by part, bit by bit, but this is their style of doing so. We are anticipating more solid evidence. I definitely know that they will have the viral type, these guys, so we will definitely receive more evidence. Yet we have a bit doubts about the credibility of our security services, the increases capabilities with this case. But yet, with the big fishes like occupation of Crimea, MH17, Russian troops, with big fishes, we never had any problems and never had any failure. So I truly believe that our security service, our institution will provide all the information required, and now even more, because honestly saying, I think they didn't count it on such a strong reaction from the international community. Myself, I was working as a journalist for Washington Post in 2014, and I know quite sure that liberal journalists with the best standards of fact-checking are a bit concerned with the credibility. So we definitely need to work out on this to restore the trust on our institution. But if we will provide this solid evidence, that I truly believe that the trust will be restored.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying as well, because Ukraine ought to be better placed than, say, France or the United Kingdom or one of the other countries that sometimes points the finger of blame at Russia at actually pinning something down, because people in Ukraine, on the whole, understand Russian, and you'd have thought that they would be better at beating Russia at their own game than, say, the average European government. Does that sound fair to you, Ambassador?
Well, I think, of course, that they are trying to do that, but it's true that we need more evidence, and the public opinion, journalists in Ukraine, outside Ukraine, need more evidence on what exactly was behind this choice, in fact. And again, I think that the life of Mr. Babchenko could have been protected by other means, less dramatic means.
24/7 surveillance.
Without staging this fake murder with some details which are not very verified, and probably by taking him out of the city and protecting him somewhere, and making maybe staging some kind of disappearance of Mr. Babchenko, and see what happens under protection of the SBU. But they have chosen to stage a murder and to go publicly to publicize this murder with photographs and with many details.
In all your years as a diplomat, have you ever seen anything that you could compare this to in terms of the unusual nature, shall we say, of staging the death of something? Have you ever heard of anything like this before?
No, I don't think so. I've seen in the press this morning that something happened in the 90s in France when a refugee from Romania was threatened by the secret police of Romania and has been protected by the French Secret Service, but had been protected by putting him in a safe place and protecting him during all the time that it was needed to protect him. But I don't know more details about this issue, which was in another context during the 90s, in fact.
Okay, so a pretty unprecedented sequence of events. I just want to move on to the whole topic of fake news. And it's good to have Katerina with us, because Katerina, of course, you're an expert on fake news and debunking it. And I'm just wondering, Ukraine, a deeply polarized country, with the East and the West, different sets of circumstances in two different parts of the country. How big a problem is fake news there in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, the thing that I would like to once again put into the context is that we should always remember that this was an operation aimed not only at protecting the life of Babchenko and also other 30 people, but first of all, uncovering the entire network of people who are planning assassinations in Ukraine. So I think when we're talking about what different measures could been taken by Ukrainian SBU, we should keep it in mind that Babchenko wasn't the only aim, the only target of them. When it comes to fake news in Ukraine, I would disagree a little bit with the depolarization of Ukrainians. It definitely has changed after Russia has attacked Ukraine back in 2014, because in a way, the biggest difference that was disuniting Ukrainians before that, which was, let's say, issues of language or of the history or the geopolitical choices, in a way, they all went away, because Russia, which was believed to be the biggest brotherhood nation of Ukrainians, proved to be an aggressor. Also, with Russian language in Ukraine, many people saw that Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they have absolutely patriotic position, and they go to eastern Ukraine to protect the country, meaning that language in Ukraine is not something which determines your political position or your citizenship position. Definitely, Russians has been very much flexible in their fake news techniques when it comes to Ukraine. We can see that in first year of the Russian annexation of Crimea and attack on Ukraine in 2014, I would say that the technique for 2014 and 2015 would be disseminating Kremlin narrative, saying that Crimea went away to Russia willingly. There is no Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine. There was a civil war. Then MH17 was shot by Ukrainians, and so on and so forth. But those Kremlin narratives, they proved to be highly unsuccessful in Ukraine. Most of the Ukrainians, they don't believe the biggest narratives of Kremlin about Ukraine, meaning that Russia has changed the tactics. So we can see that the biggest amount of time and energy and finance is being spent by Russians right now to use internal conflicts of Ukraine. So they aren't producing the Kremlin narrative about Ukraine as such, but they are using political divisions, the dissatisfaction of Ukrainians in authorities, different quarrels which are happening in Ukraine, and this is also a technique which is being used against other states. So they aren't trying to use their financial power and also the media power in order to increase the soft power of Russia, meaning to make Russia look better, but in order to use the weaknesses of Ukraine and other countries.
All right, we're running out of time pretty quickly. Dennis, let me just turn to you. Of course, fake news, not just a problem for Ukraine, but fake news believed to have originated from Russia, a problem in other countries in the region as well, not least here.
Yeah, we have in France. We have the problem with the fake news. The election campaign of President Macron suffered from it as well, and the referendum in Scotland. We had as well the Russian meddling. Recently, there was a report published by the Spanish CNA. It's like security service agency, stating that there was a Russian meddling in the Catalonia affair. So we see that the information itself, we live in an era, in an epoch of information, and we see that information is used in order to advance the agenda of foreign states. And for instance, in France, here we'll be having recently a new law, a new legislation that will be debated by the National Assembly at the beginning of June regarding how actually we can protect our state from the meddling from other states using the media and the information.
Okay, so steps are being taken to try to fix the problem and to try to quell the flood of fake news internationally. Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. You've had the last word, Denis Kolesnik. Thank you very much indeed for coming to see us. Thank you very much indeed to you, former French ambassador to Moscow, Claude Blanche-Maison. Thank you very much. And thank you to our guests in Kiev, Alex Ryabchin, member of the Ukrainian Parliament. Thank you very much indeed to you for talking to us. And Katerina Kruk, fellow at the think tank Kremlin Watch. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you very much indeed to you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24. Okay, well, it's time now for Media Watch, and I'm joined here in the studio by Emma James. And Emma, you've been looking at some of the reaction to this bizarre murder mystery that didn't turn out to be a murder at all.
Yes, absolutely. I was saying yesterday it's very much like one of those police shows where they use very unconventional methods in order to catch a killer. And it does seem that people really have got quite caught up in this tale. But interestingly, when you look at Russian coverage, looking at their reactions, certainly looking at RT, it doesn't jump out at you, this story. It's almost as though they've decided it's really not that important. We're not going to give it undue prominence. In fact, the only thing that's been added recently is a story talking about the fact that the UK Foreign Minister, Boris Johnson, who would like to be the Prime Minister, hasn't actually tweeted any reaction to the fact that Arkady Babchenko is still alive, because if we go to his Twitter account, the last tweet that he has written is still this one: appalled to see another vocal Russian journalist murdered. So that's the thing that Russia Today are drawing attention to. That's quite amusing on their part. They're also tweeting the fact that, as far as they're concerned, they see similarities between the case of Julia and Sergei Skripal, the former Russian spy who was poisoned in the southwest of the United Kingdom. And they're talking about how then everyone said it was highly likely that Russia were behind the attack. Now both are recovering. And of course, Yulia, the daughter, has shown up on television. They're saying, as regards to Babchenko, that he was supposedly killed in Ukraine, and he's now emerged alive and well on television. And you're getting responses to it like this one. Just believe the magic of Novichok. They're implying that Yulia Skripal actually looks better now that she's been poisoned than she did before. So lots of reactions like that from Russia. And it does seem that they are far more focused on Ukraine's role in all this than they are on any alleged Russian plot, which is, of course, what Ukraine says this was all about in the first place. Komsomolskaya Pravda is among those reporting on this, saying that more people will start believing that Ukraine were behind the shooting down of MH17. So all of these things that have been blamed on Russia, that Russia has been denying, people now, it's almost like it's open season, really, to deny it, to say that perhaps Ukraine was behind it. It's not just the Russians who have questions. Many journalist groups are also questioning the way in which this has been handled. Now, the Committee to Protect Journalists says it has an awful lot of questions, including this one. Why did the Ukrainian authorities publicly blame the Russian security services for the alleged assassination plot prior to completing an investigation and charging the suspected plotters. Other journalists are talking about the fact that really they feel this is actually going to put more journalists in danger and also give people far more reason to disbelieve it. Every time a journalist is murdered, those responsible will unleash their bots and propagandists to say it is fake news. Those are the words of Lindsay Hilsum, international editor for Channel 4 News, a very respected journalist who's been in her fair share of war zones as well. Interestingly, Reporters Without Borders probably have the strongest words on this one. It is pathetic and regrettable that the Ukrainian police have played with the truth, whatever their motive for the stunt. And that's really interesting choice of phrase there, whatever their motive, because the implication is that it wasn't that this saved Babchenko's life because they already had somebody in custody. This was about trying to get to those who were behind it, perhaps saving lives in future, but this wasn't necessarily about saving his life in particular. Interesting tweet from the Ukrainian ambassador to Austria, who says, "I am positively amazed about the number of people surprised that Babchenko chose to stay alive and to trap his killers instead of getting killed and preserving his journalistic integrity." So some people really feel that perhaps the emphasis now has gone a little awry, and perhaps we should all maybe put ourselves in the shoes of a man who's being targeted and believes he's being targeted for murder by Russian authorities.
OK, well, thank you very much indeed for that. Emma James there with today's edition of Media Watch. And that's it from me. The news is up at 8 o'clock. Do stay tuned for that.